Okay, got it. Well, welcome everybody. Good afternoon, and it gives me a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Yogi Hale Hendlin, who is an environmental philosopher and a public health scientist. And he's currently the assistant professor at the Erasmus School of Philosophy and co-faculty of the Dynamics of Inclusive Prosperity initiative at Erasmus University, Rotterdam, as well as research associate in the Environmental Health Initiative at the University of California, San Francisco. Dr. Hendlin's interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research projects, they tackle major questions in philosophy of biology, environmental philosophy, and political philosophy. His epistemological inquiries into public health follow the via negativa of agnotology. I hope I'm pronouncing it right, which is the study of willful acts to spread confusion and deceit, comprehending the systemic transmission of ignorance, which seems extraordinarily fascinating topic to study. His research has been published in journals, which cut across medicine, like Annals of Internal Medicine, British Medical Journal, American Journal of Public Health, Environmental Ethics, and Environmental Philosophy. So today in this development and research seminar, he is going to be talking, and his talk is entitled Chemical Colonialism, Environmental Justice, and Industrial Epidemics. In this talk, Dr. Hendlin will discuss the implications, drivers, and points of resistance of this industrial epidemic, drawing on a recent publication in Environment and Society as part of his current book project. So over to you, Dr. Hendlin. I think 20 minutes presentation, and then we'll open the floor for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very warm introduction, Dr. Satya Mala. And thank you to ISS for having me at this development research seminar. I wish I could be there in person, and I hope to soon be able to meet you all in person. So this question of chemical colonialism, I have come to over the last 15 years studying industry documents from many different industries. Here I'll focus on those from the chemical industry and look at the environmental justice and industrial epidemics that come from the environmental injustices. So I'll start just with a quote from Rachel Carson. She writes, "It's ironic to think that man might determine his own future by something so seemingly trivial as the choice of an insect spray." Now, the recent translation of Fabian Scheidler's book, The End of the Meg Machine, talks about the history of the metallurgical and fossil fuel complex, as he calls it. And the metallurgical complex involves, in part, this idea that we need to extract, we need to do the things we're doing, the strip mining, which has been going on for over 500 years in Europe first, and then all around the world, because the goods that we gain from this are worth it. They bring us civilization, they bring us more, right? So he says, the narrative of a mission to save humanity justifies and allows the destruction of other forms of social organization through this mining. And Scheidler remarks that this history of violent missions, also keyed in with Christianity here, did not begin during modern times in the so-called New World, but much earlier. And here he writes crucially, that which indigenous peoples of America and elsewhere experienced after the arrival of Columbus have already been endured by the indigenous people of Central and Eastern Europe. And I like this idea of sort of reclaiming this idea that there were indigenous European cultures and peoples because, it's so far in history beyond that, that it's hard to think of Europeans as indigenous peoples that themselves underwent a colonization that wasn't just religious, but also symbolic and material. And one of the cases Scheidler gives here is a mission to colonize sort of heathens who worshipped trees and well springs. And after these people would not listen to Christianity, the troops were sent in. And Scheidler writes, the annihilation of the symbolic order aimed to destroy the social fabric that had empowered resistance to the invasion. And before colonizing the world, Europe itself had been brutally colonized. And I want to hold on to this idea because it will help us understand better why we can speak of a chemical colonization and how there's been different waves of deployment of chemical industrial complexes and metallurgical industrial complexes and the human and more than human health harms from that. So exhibit A of this tendency is the now well-known and infamous World Bank memorandum from Lawrence Summers, in which he says that the underpolluted poor countries should be more polluted. They have vastly inefficiently low pollution compared to major industrialized places, and that it's too bad that we can't just export all of our pollution to the poor countries of the world where the wage is less. And so it makes it perfect, and he says impeccable economic sense to pollute those places where people have the lowest wages. Now, of course, implicit in this is that there's a world system in which lower wages have already been instituted as part of a colonial structure. And so there's a sort of fatalism, you could say, that we see with the argument of contamination, going back to Agricola's, Georgi Agricola's argument in the 1500s. We can see, as Carolyn Merchant points out in her book, The Death of Nature, quote, Agricola responded that most mines occurred in unproductive, gloomy areas. When the trees were removed from more productive sites, fertile fields could be created, the profits from which would reimburse local inhabitants for their losses in timber supplies. Where the birds and animals had been destroyed by mining operations, the numbers or the profits could be used to purchase birds without number and edible beasts and fish everywhere and refurbish the area. So going against what we've seen recently in the last decade with the UN's True Accounting Task Force, which takes into account all of the externalities that are not normally figured in the balance sheet when we do our cost benefit analyses, economic analyses. Here we have this idea that there's infinite profit from sort of the despoiling of natural areas and the people who would, the local inhabitants that would lose out from this, and that they could buy many times over the goods that they would have lost. And this is, basic to neoclassical economics, right? The sanctity of individual choice, the fungibility of economic goods and inputs, and the faith in the market system to bring forth substitutes at relative price changes. So now I'm going to give an example that's not in that paper mentioned on the chemical Anthropocene. And this is the example of phosphorus. So phosphorus is one of the key ingredients in all farming. And indeed, it accounts for 1% of our human body mass. 200 years ago and prior, human waste was the most prized fertilizer of all because it had phosphorus in it, even before we even knew how important it was. But again, ironically, part of our industrial epidemics, as helpful as the sanitation revolution was for first Europe and then the world in dealing with infectious diseases. It also literally flushed down the toilet this yellow gold, right? This phosphorus that we cannot have agriculture without. And in fact, demand is currently rising twice as fast as the growing human population. From 1950 to 2000, global phosphate rock production increased sixfold. So the first phosphate deposits were found or recognized in 1870 in the Southeast US, and soon they were globalized. The EU in 2014 added phosphate rock to its list of critical raw materials with high supply risk and economic importance, just to show a little bit of why this mineral is so important. Isaac Asimov, the writer and chemist, called phosphorus life's bottleneck. And Noah Polanski, a geochemist at Yale, says that phosphorus is really what limits the capacity, the carrying capacity for the biosphere. Now let's look at how this sort of chemical colonialism occurred. So we know that we can get phosphorus from agricultural waste. I would say cow waste being the most prevalent. But when phosphorus actually goes into water, it becomes a toxin, right? So we have, with this substance, it's something we absolutely need, and it's something crucial for our farming. But once it gets into water, it disperses. You can't get it back out easily at all. And what occurs is that it poisons the water, and it devastates, creates pond scum, basically. So this is a story about how phosphate rock was mined, and how the world's smallest republic, the island nation of Nauru, got duped into exchanging natural capital for money. Now we can't really say duped, because they probably didn't have so much of a choice about it with the realpolitik of the time. But what ended up happening is they was discovered, this nation some 3,000 kilometers northeast of Australia, 40 kilometers south of the equator. This very small island had a ton of phosphate rock, right? It was in 1900, right after the big phosphate craze arose. It was discovered on Nauru, and there was phosphate was strip mined, and a trust fund was set up, which was quickly drained. But after a century of phosphate mining, about 80 to 90% of the island is completely devastated, as you can see in the picture there. I think it's ironic that their motto is God's will first. The people of Nauru for decades had among the highest per capita incomes in the world, but all that money is gone, and with nothing to show for it, and their island is destroyed. Now there's depression, alcoholism, and suicide on the island amongst the people. In a 2019 expose, photojournalist Merdula Amin would interview children who would respond to even the simplest questions. She would ask with, "I want to kill myself." So we see here that this was a sort of chemical, or in this case, mineral colonialism. Now, a lot of the raison d'etre of the instrumentalism of chemical use and production in our society is based on the conventional notion of the environmental Kuznets curve, right? Right here. So the notion that people are low income, but they have lots of environmental resources, and then when they use these, they use up their natural capital to get more financial capital, and once they get to a certain point, they realize that they want more natural capital, or they can live better. The idea is they can live longer, there's more equity overall, and they will work on restoring their environment. But we've seen that there's two things that happen. One, there's new toxics that come online. And two, oftentimes there's a race to the bottom, which I'll talk about in just a moment. So just a little bit of conceptual framing before we go further with these examples of chemical colonialism and industrial epidemics, and that's looking at agnotology, the study of ignorance. So in Courtney and Carrier's book, they write, whether it be global warming, the health effects of smoking, or environmental pollutants, the relation of processed foods to high blood pressure, obesity, and diabetes, or the safety and efficacy of prescription drugs. In each case, the public is confused, uninformed, or in some other way ignorant. And in each case, this ignorance has been, to use Robert Proctor's phrase, quote, man-made, maintained, and manipulated by science, by an increasingly politicized and commercialized science. And we can see here, for example, this is global air pollution. And 92% of the population suffers from polluted air, according to the WHO. But why is this happening? You could ask, in this severe sense, where most of the industrializing world is now subject to the most air pollution. And it becomes clear when we look at the CO2 emissions embedded in trade. A lot of these same countries, the ones in blue or in the lighter colors, are actually exporting their CO2 to Europe, North America, and other areas which are net importers of CO2. So right now we have a trade in embodied CO2 in products where these other places are importing the CO2 that's being off-gassed in the blue areas. And bringing this back to the sort of human, environmental, and more than human realm, or what's called planetary health, we can see that synthetic pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers all impact the relationship between soil health, climate environmental health, and human health, right? And that even plants themselves are severely harmed and actually can become addicted to fertilizers, where we're getting a lot more macronutrients. But as they're given these macronutrients, they fail to take up the micronutrients, which we also desperately need because they're being overwhelmed by the sort of, you could say, the fast food version of nutrients, which they're getting from fertilizer. Another example, which we can see of how science is being used in a way that kicks the bucket of accountability down the road, is in the case of glyphosate. Glyphosate's the most used pesticide. It's actually an herbicide in the history of humanity. And in 2015, the International Cancer Research Association found, which is a UN working group, found that there's limited evidence in humans for the carcinogenicity of glyphosate. But what they did not manage to get through, however, is this positive association between glyphosate and multiple myeloma. They got it for non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, but multiple myeloma was not on the charge sheet, partially due to Monsanto's industry meddling. Now, we know that Monsanto has a long history of working to undermine independent regulatory bodies, as in the 2019 EU Parliament case, where glyphosate was renewed, and the assessment report from Germany, it was actually found that the German Federal Institute for Risk Assessment, the BRF, had copy and pasted verbatim 81.4% of its chapters from industry-sponsored front groups. And this was a EU Parliament commissioned report to look into this plagiarism, and it was found that this was indeed the case. We also see that as early as 1985, that Monsanto itself, now Bayer, suspects glyphosate to be carcinogenic. They found kidney adenomas in mice. And senior management at the EPA, they thought that they should classify glyphosate as a class 3 possible human carcinogen in 1985. But Monsanto worked with representatives and colleagues of theirs in the Environmental Protection Agency in the US to not have that be the case. More recently, in working up to the IARC report, Monsanto was looking to make itself as a representative of regulators, farmers, and society. And they constructed a panel, they said, not ultimately about arguing the science and evidence, but about the consequences of signaling cancer risk based on precaution and potential hazard. And so basically they're arguing for a safe until proven toxic rather than a toxic until proven safe model. We also see very clearly here from this email from Thomas Sorahan to Monsanto employees that this academic said that his paper and his testimony on multiple myeloma was instrumental in not having multiple myeloma included on the charge sheet for what glyphosate actually does in terms of the different cancers it causes. And of course, these remarks are confidential and he does not want to be referenced. But due to these industry documents, we now know a little bit more about what happened on the inside. And in the end, it did happen that the US did confirm through their Agency for Toxic Substance and Disease Registry that numerous studies reported risk ratios greater than 1 for associations between glyphosate exposure and risk of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and multiple myeloma. But during the process of this, Jess Rowland, who was an EPA senior researcher, said to Monsanto Regulatory Affairs, if I can kill this, the Agency on Toxic Substances and Disease Registry's report on glyphosate, if I can kill this, I should get a medal. But even Monsanto sponsored studies show the same thing as WHO cancer experts and a meta-analysis that glyphosate is indeed carcinogenic. We know that there has been litigation. There was a $10.9 billion settlement in 2020 in the US, but even this sum of $10.9 billion for US cases, Deutsche Bank, which represents Bayer, Monsanto, said, while this settlement undoubtedly constitutes a large sum of money, we believe that it provides a reasonable degree of finality to the litigation issue and that it removes a significant overhang in the investment case. That is, after this settlement, Bayer's stock went up because it was seen that this was getting off cheap for all the damage they had done. So a lot of the work I do is from the industry documents at UCSF. That's industry-documents.ucsf.edu at the University of California, San Francisco, where I'm a research associate in the Environmental Health Initiative. And as you can see, we have over 100 million documents from the tobacco, drug, chemical, food, and fossil fuel industries. We also have pharmaceutical opioid industry documents, and they're forever expanding. So please feel free and look for yourself. There are many documents in Dutch pertaining to the Netherlands as well. So what we see here, and this is from a forthcoming paper I co-authored with my colleagues in the Union for Concerned Scientists, what we see is that science can protect the public, but that the industry can interfere at every step. Industry often will fake the science, they'll manufacture uncertainty that harass scientists who speak out. We've seen this most recently with Stephen Donziger, the lawyer, who rendered a multi-billion-dollar judgment against Chevron in Ecuador, and now was sentenced to time in jail for obstructing justice by a Chevron-appointed judge in the US. Industries can buy credibility and manipulate government officials. So there are a lot of commonalities between these different sort of industries. One is the compartmentalization. For example, in the EU, REACH looks at each active chemical, not the adjuvants or the other chemicals that actually create dysergistic effects. We're currently on the regulatory side playing what's called chemical whack-a-mole. The moment that we finally are able to muster the epidemiological evidence over decades to ban harmful chemicals, 10 more pop up. And we see AstroTurf scientific consensus made by private industry and industry paid for science. So we could say, well, is green chemistry a solution? Well, I think that we need to tread carefully here because many of the chemicals we currently use are actual shortcuts. They allow the sustaining of unsustainable lives. And to get equity and sustainability, we need to instead rethink the use, purpose, and place of chemicals in our environment. A truly green or biocompatible chemistry, therefore, needs to have a toxic until proven safe regulatory framework supporting it. And finally, biomimicry and indigenous materials science needs to be mainstreamed and funded. So I'm just on my penultimate slide here. And what we see with agriculture, because the sort of agrochemical industry is one of the largest uses of petroleum products, which is petrochemicals, and also other chemicals, is that we need to have this integrated move from conventional systems of agriculture to transitions, incorporating indigenous traditional lifeways and indigenous agroecological practices so that we can get to truly sustainable agriculture. And that includes also our substances, right? The other chemicals that we use in our everyday lives. So just to summarize here, chemical colonialism occurs as a method to outrace regulation. Industrial epidemics are a result of the involution of businesses turning from being public serving to being self-aggrandizing and having shareholder profit being the first and many times only priority. We need a global robustness standard and agreements like the current global minimum tax rate for toxics, right? There was recently a G20 agreement that countries around the world will have a minimum corporate tax, and this will allow so that corporations have to pay taxes in the countries they operate in, and so that corporations can't just go fishing from one country to another, trying to find the cheapest tax rate. And we need this for toxics so that we're not having similarly the moving around of chemical industries to countries that have less regulations, just because those countries need the employment, or they otherwise have their arms twisted. And we need to sort of own up to the fact that every stage of the industrial process harms human and ecological health, and do something about that upstream rather than just trying to triage downstream harms. And finally, we can use toxin taxes and firewalls against approving untested chemicals by getting sort of stakeholders at every political level involved, having subsidiarity, so local environments, local governments and people can say, no, we don't want this plant here, and have the local control to actually say no to companies that would forfeit their health and their environment. And we also need to own up to the fact that Europe and industrial industrialized nations have outsourced much of our most toxic chemical production elsewhere once regulation occurs, right? So if we look at DDT or atrazine, for example, atrazine is the most used pesticide in Brazil and the US, and it is also an endocrine disruptor like PFAS. It's also a bioaccumulator, and it also causes birth defects. What we're seeing is, so Syngenta is the company that makes atrazine, and Syngenta is based in Switzerland. Now, they make it here, but atrazine as a pesticide is not legally allowed to be used in the EU or Switzerland. So they're making something that they wouldn't want to use themselves. They're giving to other children something that they wouldn't want to be giving to their own. And I think we really need to own up to that, that hypocrisy globally. Thank you. Shall I stop sharing my screen?
Yes, I think it's better.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Thank you very much. Although, thank you very much, Dr. Hendlin. You are gone over time by 10 minutes almost, but I thought it was important to hear the whole story. I don't like to stop in the middle of the presentation. And I think it was very fascinating. And thank you very much. I think we can open it for discussion. And I think you can raise your hands, or I don't see anybody. Hello? Any questions, please?
Yes, I raised my hand.
Yeah.
But
Oh, I didn't see your hand. Oh, there. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Lorenzo.
Thank you so much, Yogi. Thanks for the wonderful presentation. And I mean, yes, as I told you before you started, I'm right now in the middle of a field that is contaminated by oil pollution in southern Italy. And maybe because of the place where I stand right now, I would like to ask you a question about the use of the term and then the epistemology around the idea of colony and colonization. I mean, fundamentally, when we think about colonies, we think about power relations with faraway places, with developing countries. But this kind of colonialism is something we see also within developed countries. I mean, definitely Southern Italy is not very rich, but also not a colony, literally, of some rich nation. So I'm wondering if, rather than thinking about colonialism, we could just think about the outcome of, well, capitalist logics. If what we are looking at is just maybe routine accumulation by dispossession. So, and I mean, just an extreme form of imperialism, maybe really rooted in capitalist logics.
Sure, thank you, Lorenzo. Obviously, accumulation through dispossession is a big part of it. Michel Serres has also grown this notion of Castries to look at accumulation by contamination, right? This idea that in rendering certain areas unlivable, unfit, where there's nothing else you can do there except extract. That's another way of taking property and also making sure that that area is yoked to this larger system. In my paper, I don't use the word colonialism as much as I do, I call it chemical imperialism, because I look back to the sort of Roman model where you have a center and a periphery, and where you have this sort of tithing and the bringing of the goods to the center. And what happens, of course, is that through this dispossession, that these areas are sort of left uninhabitable. They're sort of bankrupted by this process because it involves so much extraction. So I think that the capitalist framework is great, but if we look what happened in the USSR, we see similar tendencies. If we see what's happened in China, we also see similar tendencies, that there's this predatory nature of this sort of contamination based on the sort of disposability of those who were deemed less valuable, and I do mean that also in economic terms, than the sort of products to be produced, manufactured, and sold. And so I think that there is this element that is longer standing historically involved in this logic of, at its best, we will, yes, take away and render the land uninhabitable, but in the best case, again, will compensate the human victims of that, at least. Let's not even bring up the huge question of ecological devastation, of ecosystem rights or the rights of non-humans. But I think at the worst, however, what you have is just dispossession, and then this creation of a landless proletariat, right? That's eager, or will take up the jobs that no one else wants to do, right? So you create a sort of the first waves, and then multiple waves throughout the world of people who are uprooted in their sort of semiotic sphere, uprooted from their families, from their cultures, from their habitats, from their symbolic as well as material order. And I think that that's a crucial piece of this.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Any other question, please? Nobody else wants to ask a question?
Any question would be
Yes.
welcome.
I think everybody is a bit overwhelmed probably with the maybe if nobody wants to ask a question, maybe I can ask a question. No?
Otherwise, I also have more questions to ask. But, Christina, maybe you want to go first.
Yeah. I have one question, two questions actually. One is that you talked about Rachel Carson. That was in 1962, and it's already what, 6 decades after that, and so this has been going on for the last 6 decades. So and all your you ended your slide with these are the things that needs to be done, but how much do you really think is going to be possible to change? That's one. And the second one was that in your you said that agnotology being comprehending the systemic transmission of ignorance, whereas there's the other definition that says it's a willful acts to spread confusion and deceit. So why did you choose to use the word ignorance rather than deceit?
Great, thank you for those questions, Satya. So on the one hand, I think that there are many forms of ignorance, right? If we see agnotology as being the sort of verso side of epistemology, we inquire into, in a way, ignorance is endless, right? There are endless ways of being ignorant. And I do focus a lot on deceit in my academic research. However, there's also other forms of ignorance looked at in agnotology, and part of those are the sort of accidents of history, where they're not, you could say, as willful, but it's maintaining a certain form of ignorance for the sake of maintaining power structures, right, that are unequal. And so I think there's a really close connection between inequality of all kinds and agnotology and pollution. right? So I don't think you can get contamination and pollution without inequality. For example, if the CEOs of these chemical companies had to live right next to those chemical plants and go there every day and work there, the working conditions and the chemicals they would even be creating would quickly change. One, because they would either die and other people would come in and keep on dying, and sooner or later somebody would recognize a pattern. Or two, they would be so aware of the harms being caused, also intergenerationally, that these CEOs would not be willing to subject themselves to it anymore, right? So I think that there is an inextricable linkage between the harms being done and inequalities, right? The illusion of power to extricate itself from the costs of such instrumentalizing actions.
Yeah.
So the first part of your question, again, could you refresh my memory?
Sorry, this thing went off.
Could you please refresh my memory about the first part of your question again?
The first is that, that Rachel Carson's book was a classic. In 1962, whatever she said is continuous. And there's been so many struggles, so much of research done, but not very much has changed.
Sure. Yes. Well, so yeah, how my last slide was looking at what needs to be done.
Yeah.
And I do somehow keep myself from being completely cynical and pessimistic about it. How is this possible? I do think that we are hitting an ecological wall. So I think that the very fact that we are doing something unsustainable again and again and again, and the fact that one of the funny things about chemicals, especially some of the ones I talked about, like glyphosate and PFAS, is that these are in everybody. Almost every single human creature on this earth is contaminated. So part of my project is getting past this idea of purity, right? Or of sandboxing, right? Or quarantining. The sociologist Andrew Saz, he has a book called Shopping Our Way to Safety, where he says, the rich, have bottled water, organic food, and then there's, GMO food for the others, and, Flint, lead-laced tap water. And so there's this idea that you can buy your way to safety, right? That you can create what he calls an inverted quarantine from our degraded commons, right? So as our default world gets worse and worse, we see the elites that have the education and finances to do so, to quarantine themselves from the commons, from the default world. And of course, as we do that, you get the Ouroboros, the feedback loop of things getting worse, because the less that the decision makers are actually exposed to the problems that everybody else is, they get what he calls political amnesia. Now, I really like Saz's whole framing, and at the same time, I question it. I question how insulated, and he of course, in his book and other papers talks about this well. The elites cannot actually biochemically quarantine themselves. Nobody can quarantine themselves from an increasing temperature on this planet, right? Things are heating up for everybody, everywhere. There's no Mars to go to, no bat caves, right? As Bruno Latour talks about in Coming Down to Earth. I think that it's very important to go back to this notion, which I have sort of adopted from Sheila Jasnoff. She talks about techno-scientific imaginaries. And I think we have a chemical imaginary in which some people are affected and other people are not. If you are a factory worker or live next to the factory, you're more affected, of course, and that's the sort of environmental justice dimension. But the fact is that this imaginary obscures the fact that we are all being contaminated by this. And so if we look at the actual harms, and that's one of the main projects I have, is broadcasting the fact that even and especially those who think that they're immune or exceptional to these harmful effects are being served it in their fish. Their fish comes with microplastics, right? So
it's true.
Do I think that much has been done since Rachel Carson? I do. Even though we are in many senses a worse place than we were in 1962 with DDT, with the proliferation of chemicals, which we don't know how they all interact with each other.
Right.
Almost no studies, almost no funding goes into looking at how one chemical interacts with another, either inside the human body, in the air, in the soil, in the water. There's so little research done on this because the chemistry itself is so complex. You know, fluid dynamics with chemistry is just mind-bogglingly complex. And then how this affects different organisms, right? Because let's say,
sorry to interrupt you. In fact, that I would call ignorance.
Sure.
You know, not research being done. So
yeah, I agree. It's a systemic problem. So a lot of agnotology looks at the sort of systemic problems that we have, right? There are tons of grants for studying, one chemical on one small population, right? Or group of individuals. And I think that even the funding mechanisms that we have currently are spreading more ignorance because they're all downstream, right? So the more downstream your intervention or your experiment is, the more likely you are to get funded. The more you're actually looking at the true causes of this and trying to work to change them, the less likely you're to even be taken seriously.
Maybe we should get Lorenzo to ask his question. And no, before that, is anybody else want to ask or comment or say anything at all? We have a very quiet audience. Hello?
Well, it looks like there is one. Vincenzo.
Okay. Yeah, Vincenzo, it's me. Yeah, so I have just a question. Actually, I found very interesting your parallelism between, let's say, inequality and contamination. So it made me think about the Jared Diamond thesis of the fact that countries of the world that had become rich and powerful, it was due to the fact that there was a geographical lack. So I was asking, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, because I saw your video stopped, so I didn't know if you were able to listen to. Well, so I was thinking about this parallelism about, let's say, in this case, the fact that this part of the world that have been contaminated, did so because of this geographical, let's say, misfortune. So I was thinking to the case that you mentioned at the beginning of Nauru. So yeah, it was a direct connection in my head about, in my mind, about the Diamond thesis. So just to know, what do you think about it?
Yeah, thank you, Vincenzo. So that's a very complex and controversial thesis, the Diamond thesis. I do think if you look more broadly at organisms, that there is an interesting boundary between being too comfortable and too uncomfortable that actually does drive some sort of collective action and you could say invention, right? And I'm just thinking far beyond just humans, but if you go back to Kropotkin's work, which was done at about the same time as Darwin, Darwin says it's at the fringes of society of a given, in this case, he's talking about animals, where speciation occurs. And Pyotr Kropotkin, the exiled Russian prince in Siberia, he said, no, he found at the very center, at the core of the population group, you have the most speciation. And so this is sort of like a, we have lots of Goldilocks stories, right? Life emerging on Earth is a Goldilocks story. Too cold, it doesn't emerge. Too hot, it doesn't emerge. And for Diamond's thesis, I think there's a lot of different questions. If you read Fabian Scheidler's The End of the Mega Machine, he also talks about what were some of the driving forces in, you could say, the militarization of the Mediterranean and Middle East in the period 8,000 to 5,000 years ago, which led to the Bronze Age and a lot of these technological developments. And a colleague of mine, Jeremy Lent, he has a book called The Pattern Instinct. And he says, well, if we look at China, China went around the world before Europe did, but they did not colonize. China had everything that the West wanted from, you could say, about 1000 AD or CE on. And yet when China went and visited Africa or other areas, it did not colonize. It did not, produce genocide. Instead, it was, the Chinese admirals were going and sort of finding out what else is the world doing, what are their best practices, what do they have to offer. Then they would go back and report and almost leave no trace. So I think that, yeah, I have to disagree a little bit with Diamond's thesis, because in Nauru, for example, what you had was, not Nauru, excuse me, you had in part a situation of a very late colonized island. They weren't really discovered or conquered by European colonialism till quite late. And when they were, I had a picture there of a 19th century Nauru warrior, and that Nauru warrior, was not, sort of like Japan before they got the gun or allowed the gun on the island. They were still using, samurai swords to fight battles, and so I think that part of what went on resource-wise in terms of the sort of chemical or mineral exploitation that happened there had to do with a more complex notion. I see it much more like the false treaties in North America with the indigenous people, the indigenous nations, where you had ideas of, well, we're going to take your land and we're going to give you money or some, alcohol or something else in exchange. This is basically the analogy that just this moment comes to mind for the case. I'm not sure if you have a follow-up for that or not.
Yeah. Okay. I think we really need to close now but we should give a round of applause because unfortunately we don't have a live, behind the screen audience. And thank you very much. Very fascinating, and I'm sure, there'll be a lot of follow-up work. I would certainly like to follow up with you because, as I said, that I have done so much of work on the Bhopal disaster. So thank you very much, the audience, Dr. Haldren, and for Lorenzo for organizing that, and also Jessica.
Thank you very much, everyone. I really appreciate the questions and look forward to meeting you all in person sometime.
Yeah.